Kaylee stood on her front porch, thinking in dread about the amount of boxes she still had to unload and unpack before this nightmare move could be done and over with. It was her first time out on her own in the big, bad world, and she had been overwrought with excitement and anticipation. She, like many others, didn't take into account that there was work involved. And Dad wasn't there for the heavy lifting. She would have to kill her own spiders too, she thought to herself, rolling her eyes and heading back to the moving van for yet another box of books. Dusk fell quickly, and just as the last box was lugged in, she said a silent thank you to the unpacking gods for letting that last box be feather light before she dropped it and flopped with a resounding oof into the nearest armchair. Her home was a modest one-story, with 2 bedrooms and a blissfully large bathroom complete with jetted tub. Don't tell, but that was the selling point for her. It could have been a cardboard box, and she would have bought it on the spot as long as it had that damn tub. The home overlooked a vast forest, where in a near clearing stood a cliff, overlooking the large lake complete with waterfall. Indeed, the view of the gods. Another selling point. She loved the place, and the neighborhood was quiet and peaceful. A great place for a writer. Though, for a quiet place, this place seemed strangely quiet. Too quiet. She had neighbors. She had seen several of them as she unloaded the moving van. But they didn't speak, let alone acknowledge her. So strange, she thought. It almost felt like they deliberately avoided her. Gazing out her window, she could see the neighbor to her left. She was on her knees, clutching a rosary and praying with a doily on her head. The neighbor to her right was staring intently at the sky. No, not at the sky. At the moon. Across the street, a mother grasped her 2 young children. She was near tears as she held them. The children looked as confused as she was, as their mother clung to them as though she never would again. What an odd lot of people, she thought to herself. She ripped the tape from the box marked dishes and began to rummage around in it, organizing her kitchen. She didn't want to think about anything else at the moment but getting her shit together, as it were. Once the kitchen was sorted, she moved on to the living room. She was making little to no progress on moving her bookcase against the far wall opposite her television when she noticed something odd. Taking a closer look, she saw that it was writing, written in black, faded ink, with the following words. He told us not to speak of him. He told us not to stray. He said to never let anyone in. Least of all today. He told us all to follow. He told us not to cry. He told us to walk into the water. He then told us goodbye. The poem made Kaylee shudder. Creepy, she said, and resumed the insurmountable task of moving the bookcase. Once out of the way, the realization dawned upon her that the case had taken more out of her than she thought. She was utterly exhausted. She made her way through the maze of boxes towards her bedroom, silently thanking the movers for putting her bed together before they left. What more could a girl ask for of 2 burly, sweaty men? She rummaged through another box just long enough to pull out her favorite nightie and slipped into the shower before bed. As she rinsed the remaining soap from her hair, she thought she heard laughter, like that of an eerie, devilish clown. She listened intently for a moment. Nothing. She shook her head at herself and said, I'm losing it, to the wall. She finished her shower, dried her hair, and slipped the silky gown on, loving the feel against her skin. Taking the nearest stuffed animal, she then snuggled comfortably into bed and fell quickly into the embrace of deep sleep. She awoke suddenly startled. Had she heard something? The clock beside her bed read 12 a.m. She flopped back onto her pillow, raking her hands through her tangled hair. That's when she heard He told us.
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 He told us. Dozens, maybe 100 people all chanting the same 3 words over and over again outside. What the hell was going on, she wondered, as she rolled out of bed and hurried to her bedroom window. Sure enough, her ears had not deceived her. An entire neighborhood of people, her neighborhood of people, stomped the street like zombies, chanting and heading into the woods. Without thinking, she dashed outside wearing her silk nightie, not considering warmth or comfort. For a moment, all she could do was stare at the disturbing parade taking place before her. She was frightened. No, she was terrified. What the hell was this? Snapping back to her senses, she grabbed hold of the first person she reached, a tall, frail-looking man with a gaunt face, tired eyes, and matted hair swimming in a satellite dish form around the bald patch of skin adorning the center of a crown. He wore a plaid robe, a t-shirt, and a pair of pajama pants to match the robe. His brown eyes were far away, glassy and unseen, as she turned him towards her abruptly. "What's wrong with everybody? What's going on?" She shook him and shouted. His gaze fell upon her as he swayed to and fro. "He told us," was all he said before resuming his trance-like state and rejoining the horde. "Told you what? Who?" she shouted after him. But he did not respond. No one did. No one even reacted to her presence. The true horror struck her when she realized that roughly 200 yards ahead was the cliff, the 100-foot drop to the lake below. That's where they were going. Her hands shot to her mouth, and her eyes burst wide at the thought. And she began running. Could she even stop them? She had to try. Her bare feet felt like raw meat, full of ice and needles as she skidded to a halt. She had reached the end of the line, and they were just dropping, walking off the edge as though they felt the road kept going, chanting. Even on their way down to the icy waters, they were still chanting. He told us. Men, women, children, even pets, all just walking off the edge to their doom. Why? What was happening to them? It took a moment for her to realize through her panic that she was just fine. She was not compelled to drop to her death. Why were they? It was making her crazy, panic, terror. She shot her hands over her ears and screamed at them, "Stop it! Stop it! Stop!" She reached out and grabbed one of them, a child, a young boy of maybe 6 or 7. She tried holding on to him, tried keeping him from dropping away. "Stop! Please stop!" she shouted at him, and she held on tight to the boy's hand. He simply kept chanting, walking, dragging her with him. She let go of him just before the edge. "No!" she sobbed weakly. Through her tears, she could see a figure through the mass of people and trees ahead. It looked like a man, but could not have been real. Its deep lavender skin was almost pale, startlingly blue. It wore an old suit with a top hat and black gloves. The suit was nearly a match to its skin. It wore a matching bow tie and leaned forward with both hands resting on a cane. It simply stood there, its deep black eyes staring into her like it knew something she didn't. Her eyes darted from the creature to the mass of people, chanting and dropping before her. Her cries continued, as did her futile attempt to save them. By the time the last one fell, she was in the dirt, on her knees, sobbing into her hands, afraid and alone, confused and furious. She felt lost. She tried so hard. The faces of those people would be forever burned into her memory. The devilish laugh sounded again, and she knew now where it came from. She raised her head and looked furiously at the lavender man in the top hat. He simply gave her a sly grin, one that stretched across the entirety of his face. He removed his hat, revealing long black feathers where hair should have been, and bowed to her before disappearing into the darkness. He told us not to speak of him. He told us not to stray. He said to never let anyone in, least of all, today. He told us all to follow. He told us not to cry. He told us to walk into the water. He then told us goodbye.